Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the first of two related panels. You're welcome to attend one or either. One or both. And we are the colonial, the post-colonial, and the decolonial research cluster. We're sponsored by the Institute for Humanities Research at Arizona State University. The goal of the cluster is to facilitate the exchange of ideas and the production of research across historical, ideological, cultural, material, geographical, and epistemological dimensions, and apparently now across virtual dimensions as well. We invite the participation of those interested in any sites and forms of colonial conquest, resistance, complicity, and aftermaths. This is our second event of the semester. Our first was the Politics of Latinx Horror, which was a wonderful presentation. And today's presentation was suggested indirectly by my colleague and one of the panelists, Toby Harper. And he was telling me a little bit about New Zealand's history with epidemics. And here we are today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the first panelist, give the title of his talk, and then he will speak casually, formally. It's up to each person how they spend their 15 minutes or so. And then I will introduce our second panelist, Christina Stanchio, with whom I went to graduate school. So good to see you. And she will give her talk. And then Utatia, and we can you unmute yourself and help me with the pronunciation of your last name, even though I've been trying. One more time.
I can, yes. It's Chattopadhyay.
Chattopadhyay. Okay. And at that point, we'll stop recording, by the way. And then Utatia will speak, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. We might have some people jump in about 30 minutes, 45 minutes because of time zone confusion. For everybody, which is most of you, who had difficulty getting in, we are so terribly sorry, and we're glad you're here. And with that, I'd like to introduce, and also please, a little bit of housekeeping, mute yourselves. I don't think we'll have connectivity problems, but we've already had problems today, so who knows? So if we start to, we might ask you to put your screens on, to hide yourselves. Might give us some bandwidth. I don't know if that's the correct term. And then when we come to Q&A/discussion, if you could go into, I believe it would be participants, and raise your hand, and I'll be moderating that, and I should see your hands up in the order in which you place them. So without further ado, followed by that ado, we have Toby Harper, who is an assistant professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at Arizona State University. His first book came out this year in February on the British honor system, and it's called From Servants of the Empire to Everyday Heroes. It was published by Oxford University Press, and I refer you all, this is from me, he didn't put this in the bio, but I refer you all to its very good review in the Times Literary Supplement. Should we all be so accomplished? Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me to talk here. I'm gonna talk today about a little bit about the story, as the title suggests, the kind of national mythology, the stories that New Zealand tells about itself, and also about how these, well, one of the key stories that New Zealand tells about itself, and then how this connects to its history of public health, especially in relation to pandemics or epidemics. And I'm going to try to bring that up to kind of a little bit of discussion of what's going on there at the moment. And for anyone who's not following the news, for New Zealand news, there is actually an election tomorrow in New Zealand, a general election. So that's kind of, this was more immediately relevant than I thought, because I wasn't really keeping track of that. So New Zealand has this kind of repertoire of stories that likes to tell about itself. New Zealand's a very young nation created through a colonial act, or the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. It only really kind of came together as a functional state in the 1860s. And unlike a lot of other nations at the moment, its response to the current crisis seems to reinforce, maybe rather than complicate, that kind of national mythology. So New Zealand kind of does look at the moment like what it's been saying about itself, a beacon of rational reform, a blessed place if your bent runs to kind of spiritual metaphors, a place that combines laid back social norms with progressive or even experimental politics. Historically, promoters, patriots, insofar as you can call New Zealand patriotism, and politicians have called it Godzone, the Promised Land, or Better Britain. And I'll just share my slides. Or even in a more recent version of this. Wait, sorry, that was the wrong screen. A more recent version of this, and a kind of weird and perverse version of this. The marketing slogan, "New Zealand is Middle Earth," which is kind of the ultimate kind of recolonization of New Zealand. So here's some Godzone is like a term that is used in a number of different contexts in New Zealand. These Empire Marketing Board posters from the early 20th century. There is one which has honey as well. I was going to say it's a land of milk and honey, but I couldn't find the honey one this morning when I was searching for it. But these Empire Marketing Board posters are kind of great. And the sense that New Zealand is kind of this young but rapidly progressive nation. Here's a 1929 version of that, again from the Empire Marketing Board. So in this story, it's sort of a place where people, in the words of one of its most popular historians, the late Michael King, I'm sure I quoted this the last time I talked at this group, so apologies for those who were there. But I think it's a useful quote. People are good-hearted, practical, commonsensical, and tolerant. Those qualities are part of the national cultural, the national cultural capital that has in the past saved the country from the worst excesses of chauvinism and racism seen in other parts of the world. If this quote seems a little gentle and understated for an affirmation of national pride, it is because a kind of laconic, passive-aggressive modesty is also part of this cultural capital, and certainly part of the kind of classic performance of New Zealand masculinity. Even the national anthem, which is kind of a dire, dirge-like song, God of Nations, is about how God should protect New Zealand rather than advance it, which I think is another interesting manifestation of this. So the central aspect of New Zealand's national mythology that I want to talk about today is the sense that New Zealand is just a little bit relatively better than other places. Even when it's being bad, it's not as bad as other places. So I want to discuss this mythology and kind of its problems. Maybe those problems are obvious now that I mention it, and some of the ways in which thinking about New Zealand's history of public health can maybe help break past this mythology, especially in this moment where this mythology seems so strong. That maybe New Zealand shouldn't be that proud that it isn't as bad as everywhere else at dealing with a pandemic, especially given its geographical and social advantages of dealing with it. But that is kind of something that's very present in New Zealand and internationally at the moment. So for some more specific examples of this kind of mythology, I would turn to New Zealand is really famous for its beautiful landscapes, its ostensibly pristine environment, 100% pure New Zealand, to use a relatively recent tourism slogan. Again, here's a rugby ball of 100% pure New Zealand written on it. And this was installed in London, I believe. I think installed in a number of different places, but this is from London. And it's, New Zealand has a wide range of unique. It has one of the highest rates of endemism of any modern nation state in terms of animals. It's unique fauna and flora. Still, the rivers in New Zealand are kind of ravaged by agricultural runoff. The forests are full of invasive species, and a lot of the native species are teetering on the brink of extinction. Still, on the other hand, the rivers are better than California's or New England. So it's kind of New Zealand's reputation in terms of nature is overstated, but relatively, in a sense, true. New Zealand was the first state to give women a vote at a national level in 1893. It's had multiple women prime ministers. It's sort of famous for having women leadership going back a couple of decades now, especially Helen Clark and now Jacinda Ardern. Has one of the highest proportions of women involved in politics in the New Zealand Parliament. But its social, political, and cultural systems still are pretty based around a version of kind of masculinity that has its own problems. Because of some specific aspects of its colonial history, in the last 50 years, the government has been generally more responsive and careful than a lot of other kind of white majority former settler colonies in giving legal meaning to the provisions of the treaty that created New Zealand as a state, the Treaty of Waitangi. So in certain ways, this looks better compared to the United States or Australia in particular. But the fact that New Zealand wasn't as genocidal as Australia or Nazi Germany or as racist as South Africa doesn't mean that there were not aspects of New Zealand's colonization that were racist or genocidal. In fact, and it is still a state that operates largely on the legal and political rules established by the colonizers, even though it has gone perhaps further than most in attempting to come to grips with what this means culturally. New Zealand tried to build a small empire in the Pacific that I'll return to through its League of Nations mandate in Western Samoa. This empire was small, short-lived, inept, and involved some violence, but rather less than contemporary South African, Australian, Belgian, Japanese, British, or French mandates. So again, it was part of a mandate system, but its mandate was a little bit less big and less horrifying than some of the others. In recent years, New Zealand politicians have enjoyed the opportunity to compare its relatively open refugee and immigration policies to Australia's somewhat more notorious attempts at dealing with especially Southeast Asian immigration. Historically, New Zealand avoided the same notoriety that Australia accrued through its kind of white Australia policy, even though New Zealand had some of the same rules in place, and there are, again, geographical reasons why New Zealand can afford to, in a way, be pretty generous or relatively generous in its refugee policies. And now, of course, the New Zealand government and public seem to have competently managed the pandemic through a combination of quarantine, isolation, and contact tracing. And this competence would maybe appear less extraordinary if it weren't for the fact that most of Europe and the United States have struggled to contain the disease. Well, I think commentary on this tends to ignore or downplay the success of some Asian states in managing a pandemic. Again, I think that this sort of fits a pattern of how New Zealand sees itself that I think is kind of interesting. All the same, I'm being kind of a little bit sarcastic here. I would very much like to be living in New Zealand at the moment. I say this mostly as a joke, but it's also true. And this is part of the lure of that national mythology, is that it is, in a sense, there is a sense in which this is true. New Zealand is a very nice place to live if you can get to live there. But its truth obscures more than reveals some of, yeah, oh, thank you, yeah. Some of the, yeah, I'm only just getting to some of the less pleasant aspects of New Zealand's colonial past. Sometimes, indeed, I think often, New Zealanders and commentators on New Zealand have used this mythology to conceal this ugly side of New Zealand's history. So just to very briefly touch on kind of themes in the history of New Zealand's public health. This is probably a familiar story to most people here in its form, if not the specifics, that the creation of the colonial state effectively diverted any resources which were even originally being directed towards Maori health to a settler population. But initially there were some, the first kind of missionaries in New Zealand were focused on doing things to Maori, but very quickly all this focus started going into the settler population, and Maori were largely left to themselves in shrinking boundaries, in kind of economic decline, to deal with public health. And as a result, there were, the Maori population declines between 1860 and around 1900. In the 20th century, this kind of turns around. Even then, a lot of this comes out of Maori communities rather than from, and kind of in partnership with the government. A lot of government attempts at kind of addressing this were ineffective or unsuccessful until they actually succeeded in getting the communities involved, or the communities actually took the initiative and reached out and kind of pulled the government into actually investing resources in Maori communities. I had a couple of specific examples of this, but I'll leave it. If people want to ask more questions about that, I'd be interested in expanding that point. So I think it's a really interesting one. I think there's a lot of specific details there that might be of interest to people. But basically what happens is between 1860 and 1900 or so, the Maori population is in a kind of slow decline. It's generally believed by Pākehā, or European observers, that the Maori will just die out eventually. But from the beginning of the 20th century, that decline reverses, and since then the Maori population has mostly been growing. There's another kind of important shift that happens after the Second World War, where New Zealand's kind of demographics are complicated by increasing immigration from other parts of the Pacific and also other parts of the world. So the population, the kind of social complexities of that population become a lot more complex in the second half of the 20th century. Some of those immigrant populations share certain social and kind of health outcome characteristics of the Maori population, but others don't. There are ways in which there's also some important differences. So I see that I have basically no time left. So I'll skip to my conclusion. So recently there was a historian named Damon Salesa argued that New Zealand's largest and most diverse city, Auckland.
Toby, is your alarm clock going off?
Oh yes, sorry. My headphones were preventing me from hearing that. I'm sorry. So Damon Salesa recently argued that New Zealand's largest and most diverse city, Auckland, had become culturally segregated into primarily Maori Pacific regions, and he was particularly interested in the a lot of this comes from migration from other Polynesian states to Auckland, which is now the largest Polynesian city in the world. that a lot of this on paper diversity isn't necessarily reflected in the experience of going to Auckland, or it's kind of Auckland is visibly a pretty diverse city, especially compared to Christchurch or something. But in terms of the people living there, it's kind of segregated into or it's increasingly segregated. I think was part of his core point, that compared to even 10 or 20 years ago, Auckland is becoming more segregated. And this holds true in terms of health outcomes as well as the physical where people are living. So why does all this matter? Well, I think in the context of a series, it matters because the kind of political and cultural construct of New Zealand or Aotearoa New Zealand, it is a colonial construct and remains a colonial construct. At different times, the New Zealand state has approached dealing with diversity or dealing with the colonial past and the kind of the existence of immigration in different ways. It's been at different points, the New Zealand government has pursued assimilationist, integrationist, bicultural, multicultural, even kind of earlier elimination policies. But this remains as important a political question as ever. And as going into the election tomorrow, New Zealand parties are still deeply divided, and I think in certain cases don't even know their minds on how to deal with the legacy of colonization. And it's, I think, in certain ways, more complicated implications in the present. So New Zealand's success in dealing with the current pandemic, while you know, in certain ways, a sign of perhaps admirable competence, shouldn't disguise the fact that there are deeper problems, including around health outcomes, suicide rates, drug use, other something obvious I'm missing. It was earlier in my notes. That remain divided and in certain ways increasingly segregated by along lines which are kind of drawn by the colonial state. I'll finish there, sorry.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so very much. Okay, so we'll be recording one more presenter and then we'll stop the recording. We'll have a third presenter, Q&A and discussion. So our second panelist is, make sure I can see her. There we go. Is Christina Stanchio, who is an associate professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, about half a mile from where I was born, on Richmond's Monument Avenue, which is rapidly changing. Wonderful. If you don't know what I'm referring, check the Summers News. She teaches U.S. multi-ethnic and indigenous literatures, visual culture, and critical theory. And I'll read a little bit more of her bio. It's so wonderful to share her bio. I remember sitting when we were ready to get the unit or applying or enrolling in the unit, the certificate as graduate students at the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory with then Michael Rothberg. Mm-hmm. And we were both sitting there with our notes before we started our dissertation, and now I can barely fit an abridged version of her bio and all words in. So proud of her. Okay, so her first book, Our Democracy in the American Indian and Other Writings by Laura Cornelius Kellogg, co-edited with Oneida Nation. Mm-hmm. Citizen Christina Ackley was published by Syracuse University Press in 2015. Her second book, The Makings and Unmakings of Americans, Indians, and Immigrants in American Literature and Culture, 1879 to 1924, is forthcoming with Yale University Press. Christina's research, including a current book project on residential school literature and visual culture in 4 colonial states, has been funded by the American Association of University Women, the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Fulbright Scholar Award, and others. She's also published her research in many interdisciplinary journals. The title of her talk is Be Here, From Food Insecurity to Food Sovereignty in Native Communities. And let's welcome Christina. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, very much. Can you hear me okay? Is my sound? Thank you for the invitation to be part of this series. And I'd like to apologize in advance if you hear any screaming children. I hope it won't last. So my children are nearby, but hopefully they will behave. I'd also like to thank Toby for the very wonderful memories of New Zealand. The largest conference in Native American and Indigenous Studies last year was held at the University of Waikato in Hamilton. And I had the privilege to sit on the grounds where the Treaty of Waitangi was signed and to visit with Maori communities. And it was such a wonderful experience. So I think the myth, and I'm still in love with New Zealand. So I think, you know, this whole mythology really works on tourists like me. I'm gonna share my screen, and I have a few slides today. And my talk might take 2 or 3 minutes over. And I'll just say that I'm speaking as a non-native person, as an immigrant naturalized in the United States. And this is not part of my current research. This is, I took this opportunity to learn more about something. I'm interested in food sovereignty. I'm interested in a lot of similar issues in settler colonial studies. And I thank Melissa for the opportunity to think about these things for the presentation, and I welcome your feedback and suggestions. So let's get going. In the January 2020 issue of Bioscience, 11,000 scientists in 153 countries declared the climate emergency and warned that we are on the brink of untold human suffering if we do not make significant changes to the way we live. Their assessment came 40 years after the first World Climate Conference in Geneva in 1979. Clearly and unequivocally, planet Earth is facing climate emergency, they warned. The scientists outlined 6 areas of action for slowing down the impact of climate change: human population growth, meat consumption, tree cover loss, fossil fuel subsidies, and annual losses to extreme weather events. Swift action, they concluded, is our best hope to sustain life on Earth. Just a few weeks later, COVID-19 struck, and its consequences for Indigenous communities all over the world have been devastating, as I'm sure most of you are aware. There are over 476 million Indigenous people in the world living in 90 countries, and they account for about 6.2% of the global population. And Indigenous people's life expectancy is up to 20 years lower than the life expectancy of non-Indigenous people worldwide. Native American communities have been hit hard by COVID-19, some of them with disproportionately higher infection and death rates than the US population at large. BBC Future reported at the end of July this year on how, quote, COVID-19 could destroy Indigenous communities, end quote, citing high infection rates, precarity, high rates of pre-existing conditions, and poor nutrition. In the US, for example, 1 in every 2,300 Indigenous Americans has died, compared to 1 in 3,600 white Americans. There are currently, as you can see here on the slide, 574 federally recognized Native tribes across the United States, and that's a population of about 2% of the US population. Some in remote parts of the country with limited access to basic resources. And as we remember from the news in March, many tribes declared states of emergency, and some of the tribes are still in this continuous state of emergency. This is a recent graph from the APM Research Lab showing Black and Indigenous Americans experiencing the highest death tolls from COVID-19. And it's data collected through September the 15th, but I think it's still relevant to show that one of the lowest demographics in the US is actually experiencing the highest death rates. According to Indian Country Today and to data from the Indian health system, at the end of August 2020, there were over 20,000 positive cases of coronavirus in Indigenous communities in the US, as well as over 700 deaths. The Diné people, I thought I would give this example since you're located in Arizona, and Arizona is home to a lot of tribes nations, the Diné people of the Navajo Nation, for instance, which is the largest reservation in the United States, have been hit very hard. More than 150,000 people live on the Navajo reservation right now. And as you can see, it stretches a lot of thousands, I think it's 27,000 square miles across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. A high prevalence of diseases like diabetes, coupled with scarcity of running water and homes with several generations living under the same roof, have contributed to the spread of the disease. As of October 10th, so just a few days ago, the number of cases had reached 10,675, with over 560 confirmed deaths. The reservation is now under daily curfew, and more than 40,000 Navajo people have been tested. Many disadvantaged communities in the US, as we know, are at higher risk for COVID-19 infection than the general population through national race desegregated, though national race desegregated data is lacking. In a recent issue of Science magazine, Abigail Echohawk, whom you can see here in a nice drawing published in Science magazine. Abigail Echohawk is a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle. She shows how racial misclassification and the exclusion of Indigenous communities from data sets and analyses continue to influence public health data on Native communities. Hospital intake forms, for example, often group Native people in the category of other. Even the CDC reports on maternal mortality have only 3 racial categories, which I didn't know about: white, Black, and Hispanic, which leaves Native data out. As many of you in the audience and on the panel know, settler colonialism has a long history of using data against Indigenous people. The US Census, for example, which began in 1790, excluded American Indians until 1860, and it didn't count those living on reservations until 1900, thus further justifying and authorizing, in a sense, white settlement. As Abigail Echohawk puts it, quote, "I see being eliminated in the data as an ongoing part," this is the quote you have in front of you, "as an ongoing part of the continuing genocide of American Indians and Alaska Natives. If you eliminate us in the data, we no longer exist," end quote. Settler colonial scholars of settler colonialism call this phenomenon of exclusion data colonialism, which is something I would love to know more about in the future. Although the data tell a grim story we should pay close attention to, we also know that viral epidemics have plagued Indigenous communities for centuries. The lack of immunity to novel viruses brought to the Americas decimated close to 90% of the Indigenous population throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And during the 1918 influenza epidemic, depending on the sources you look at, between 3,000 and 6,000 Native Americans died to the epidemic. As Lorenzo Veracini has argued in a 2013 article in Interventions, viruses and colonialism/imperialism are related. He says, quote, "Colonial and settler colonial forms are also always intertwined, and the determination to exploit Indigenous others is always mixed with a will to displace them. According to this logic, while Indigenous people disappear as a result of some sort of viral contagion," Veracini argues, "the settlers bacterially replace them as a result of superior efficiency," end quote. Yet, as the UNESCO First Bulletin on Indigenous Peoples noted in August 2020, the pandemic crisis highlighted inequalities while also shining light on new opportunities. And it also emphasized that the current crisis has highlighted the need to work towards systems that can reconcile health and nature. And this is, I found this slide on social media a few months ago, and it's from the Indian Collective. And it was issued during the quarantine, and it says self-quarantine, but make it indigenous. And you can read it on your own. My favorite is the second one. The second piece of advice: start seedlings, it's spring. Environmental health researchers have shown that disruptions to food and nutrition security for indigenous populations during pandemics exacerbate their vulnerability to climate change. And the effects of climate change undermine indigenous food security, compromising the resilience of indigenous populations to pandemics. In this context, understanding, reinforcing, and protecting indigenous food systems is central to post-pandemic recovery. During self-isolation, reliance on indigenous food systems depends on indigenous knowledge about the land, the rivers, and biodiversity, which includes knowledge of local techniques to preserve and prepare food. When COVID-19 began sweeping through the Navajo Nation, Cynthia Wilson started Seeds and Sheep, an initiative that provides Navajos with sheep to raise and the means to start their own gardens. And since the beginning of the pandemic, she has sent thousands of packets of seeds from her home in Monument Valley, Arizona, to her relatives from Monument Valley, Utah, to her relatives in Arizona. To her, the seeds represent a connection to culture, wellness, the earth, and family. Her seed distribution effort is meant to encourage farmers, community members, to get back to restoring their own food systems for their families. In a contemporary context of climate emergency, ongoing capitalist extraction, food insecurity, dwindling natural resources, and impeding ecological disaster, Wilson's project exemplifies what the researchers in the first slide I show you in bioscience called swift action, right? So this is a model, right, for sustainability, and a turn to indigenous teachings about both foodways and sustainability at a time marked by food insecurity, both in her community and worldwide. I wanted to show you these examples that they also come from Arizona, and these are the two Arizona counties with the highest percentage of native food insecurity. And we see the levels of food insecurity in 2018 across Apache, Navajo, Maricopa counties, and then compared to the entire state of Arizona. And we see the projections for this year, which are quite higher than 2 years ago. This is moving towards the end of my talk. This is one of my heroes. Her name is Winona LaDuke, and she is an Anishinaabe environmental activist. And if you're following politics and the recent presidential debates, she was a formal vice presidential candidate for Ralph Nader. She embodies, I think, many communities' ongoing fight for food sovereignty, for environmental protection, for economic self-determination as essential platforms for community regeneration, renewal, and survival. As she defines it, to be sovereign is, quote, to have an economy that is internal. Grow your own food, produce your own energy, she says. As literary scholar Joni Adamson has shown, the food sovereignty movement also originates in indigenous campaigns to force states to abide by treaty obligations, which include the right to first foods, like salmon, elk, deer, and many others. Some of the barriers preventing access to native foods, which have both spiritual traditional significance and health benefits, include knowledge about these foods, as well as their convenience and availability. The goal of the food sovereignty movement is to democratize food production, distribution, and consumption as an alternative to neoliberal economic development and industrial agriculture by shifting the focus from one's right to access food to one's right to produce it. In a virtual panel on COVID-19 and the Indigenous Just Transition, which happened in April this year, Winona LaDuke addressed the current crisis as a moment of enlightenment, quote unquote, a time of reflection, an opportunity for people to learn to be self-sufficient. She called for a renewed effort to change our behavior, quote unquote, to do resilience training, to relocalize, to be efficient. She called for rebuilding communities. Be here now. This is where my title comes from. In a conversation with Bill McKibben on decarbonization, localization, and just transition, LaDuke said, also in April, COVID-19 is a terrible disease, but let's not squander this opportunity to slow down, decommodify, decolonize, and re-indigenize to protect the places we love. The climate, the planet, the creatures need the new normal to look dramatically different from the old normal. Now is our moment of opportunity. Let's localize our economy, get cleaner, healthier, and grow victory gardens, resilience gardens, or sovereign seed gardens. Now is a good time to start those seeds. And I think the historians may remember that during World War II, a lot of, I forget the percentage, but close to 50% of the US, the fruits and vegetables grown in the US were grown in victory gardens, right? They were planted in backyards and school grounds. Even Eleanor Roosevelt planted a victory garden at the White House. So there's that tradition. The collective self-determination over food systems that LaDuke proposes prompts Indigenous peoples to describe food injustice, according to Potawatomi philosopher Kyle White, as, quote, a violation of their collective self-determination over their food systems, end quote, inflicted by colonial societies to undermine Indigenous self-determination. Rethinking material economy and capitalism, therefore, are at the heart of Winona LaDuke's many sustainable projects. And I'll just share with you one in conclusion. This is Honor the Earth. You can Google it. You can book her as a speaker if you haven't done so already. She's a very popular speaker. And so at the heart of LaDuke's many projects, sustainable projects, which include wild rice, hemp, renewable energy, and many others. Her call is for the next economy, which is a green one. And I'll leave you with this, which might be a nice transition to the next speaker. Invoking an op-ed by Arundhati Roy in Financial Times, also in early April 2020, The Pandemic is a Portal, LaDuke used Roy's metaphor of the portal to argue for action. Noting the pandemic's reduction of air pollution by over 20%, as well as the reduction of fossil fuel since COVID-19 started, LaDuke calls for both imagining and fighting for a new world. And I'll leave you with this beautiful quote from Arundhati Roy's The Pandemic is a Portal. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it, end quote.